we've been in the book of Galatians for the last couple of weeks. That's one of the go-to kind of books that should be on both sides as far as trying to understand and see where we need to be with the Messianic perspectives. We first, what am I hearing all of a sudden?
Yeah, that's good.
That's different. I haven't heard that one yet. But anyway, so we first looked at the apostleship of Paul and why he can and should be listened to. Paul, according to Acts chapter 9, he is the Lord's choice instrument to carry my name before the nations and kings and Bnei Israel. And so he began that traveling. He began sharing the gospel, the good news. We talked about it last week in the sense of how it is the good news that can be found in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament, that redemptive plan of God to restore humanity to relationship with Him, by singling out a nation, singling out Israel, but using them to bring blessing to all the nations. When the nations come in the proper way, in the proper order, coming to Israel, they come underneath that blessing that God is pouring out upon them, and that is there overflows to the rest of the nations. So the gospel was always to bring those who were near to God and His ways, the Jewish people. That good news was always to bring them together with those who are maybe far from God and His ways. That's the Gentiles. But that can be a hard truth to understand, a hard goal to live out, a hard relationship to maintain. But it's the practical, it's the working out of this new combination of people with different backgrounds, different ways of life, into the one new man of Jew and Gentile. That was not easy. So the issue that the early congregations of Yeshua were trying to figure out was, how are these Gentiles brought in? What's the standard? What's the practice? What's the rule or the order of things? How are they justified and declared righteous? How are they declared not guilty before God? How can we be in fellowship with them when their lives are so different? Because that's really the starting point. These Gentiles have not been typically living in God's ways. They have no idea how to, really. How can they be saved from God's wrath when their lives carry these lingering issues from where they came from in that pagan way of life? How can we continue to fellowship with one another when our lives are so different? Not everyone understood it. Not everybody accepted it. Some tried to force it into their more traditional, comfortable understandings of how things worked. But Paul, he knows the gospel. He knows the redemptive plan and purpose of God. He knows that is a hill upon which it's worth dying. That we've got to get this right. For him, the issue has to be settled and worked out, because that's the future of God's people at stake. He's got to get this issue understood. And if his generation gets this wrong, then it's going to set the whole course of where they're going in the wrong direction. Then the Jewish people will never be able to fulfill their purpose to be the light of the nations. The Gentiles will not be brought in under the blessing of God, nor be even taught God and His ways. They'll be thinking that it's not really a way for you to live. So the early congregations had to learn the reality of justification of the Gentiles in fulfillment of God's purpose and plan the hard way. And that came sometimes with some uncomfortable confrontation and some conflict. Some of these people, began following Paul on his missionary journeys. They were waiting for him to leave and go off to a new location. And then they would come in behind him and undermine what he said in his teaching. We'll get to more explanation of that in a little bit. But it's really hard to get our mind around this time and the circumstances of what's going on. So to help with this, I'm going to teach a little differently today. I'm going to teach by putting all of this situation into a timeline. Okay? We're going to look at timelines and confrontations for the gospel, for the good news. And there are three markers that I want you all to keep that are going to be on this board the whole time, so to speak. The first one, if you can see it, there's a little bit of a line there. Boy, that needs to be a little darker. But you have the Crucifixion of Yeshua. That's approximately 30 AD. The second one is some years later. It's the Acts 15. It's the Jerusalem Council. They're not entirely sure exactly what year this is, but it's the late 40s, early 50s is when this potentially comes to pass. And then it's on or after Paul's second missionary journey is when the book of Galatians is written. It's after the Jerusalem Council, so it could be anywhere from 49 to about 55 AD. And they're looking at that situation. So those are the three primary ones that we're going to keep all of these things in relation to. You talk about his conversion just a couple of years after Yeshua's resurrection. Then you have Paul makes his first visit to Jerusalem. He says it's after 3 years from all of this. This is some of the passages. Acts chapter 9 says, when Saul arrived in Jerusalem, he made attempts to join up with the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he was a disciple. And this is kind of important because later on, Paul makes observations about others where he calls them false brothers and they're spying on who they are and what the freedoms that they have. That's what they thought he was. That he was a false brother, that he was spying on the freedom that they had in Messiah. But it says, Barnabas took him in and brought him to the emissaries, to the apostles. He described to them how Saul had seen the Lord on the road and how the Lord had spoken to him and how he had spoken boldly in the name of Yeshua. So Saul was with them, going in and out in Jerusalem, speaking boldly in the name of the Lord. This is how he describes it in the book of Galatians. It says, then 3 years later, I went to Jerusalem to visit with Peter, and I stayed with him 15 days. But I saw no other of the emissaries except Jacob, or James, the Lord's brother. For it was through letting the Torah, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm skipping something here. So, here is Paul. He's a Pharisee. He's been taught by Gamaliel, which is the school of Hillel. He is the Hebrew of Hebrews, as he talks himself. He's this legal scholar. He is a zealot. Is zealous enough to kill those that he determined to be blaspheming God. And he had to challenge everything that he'd grown up with. Everything that he was taught, everything that he had internalized into his way of life, his way of thinking. He had to challenge all of his previous training and traditions and understandings in light of Yeshua, who he is as Messiah. And it took him 3 years. 3 years to get that kind of ironed out and worked out. And yes, he was preaching and ministering at the time. He was arguing. He was reasoning through the scriptures. Yes, he had the Holy Spirit, but with all of that, it still took him 3 years to basically rewire his thinking. And he describes the process in Galatians chapter 2, verse 19. And I like the way that the Complete Jewish Bible puts it in here. It says, for it was through letting the Torah speak for itself that I died to its traditional legalistic misinterpretations so that I might live in direct relationship with God. I like that. When the Scripture speaks for itself, we have to give up some of our traditions. And he had a lot of that kind of tradition. He had a very rigid interpretational framework built into his thinking. He'd been trained with it. He grew up with it. That was how he was wired. And he's not alone in that. Because you and I have that same type of situation. Because you could easily put in here, letting the Torah speak for itself, that I die to its traditional Baptist misinterpretation. Are there a few of those? A few Baptist misinterpretations? Are there a few traditional evangelical misinterpretations? Catholic misinterpretations? Protestant misinterpretations? Is it hard to give those things up when you come to this understanding? Yeah, it's not very easy. I mean, we don't want to dismiss or gloss over the fact that it took 3 years for Paul to retrain his mind and his thinking and his approach to his faith. Some of you who've come in this direction, you might do so at 100 miles an hour and think that you could change everything in 6 months or less. Guess what? It's not that easy. If you call everything pagan, if you go on a slash and burn kind of policy, if you cut off all ties, that you won't have any more struggles in coming to terms with this perspective. Or worse, you may expect others to make the change or the shift maybe as fast as you did or faster than you did. You have no patience for their process and the time that it takes them to come to terms with this way of thinking. That's dangerous on our part. It took Paul 3 years. And I guarantee you, he's a man who's smarter than all of us in this room. He's a man with better training and education than you or I. He's a man who's more familiar with all of this stuff than you or I. A man, I would assume, with more time and fewer distractions than you or I have. And I say that just to remind ourselves and to be patient with where people are and how long it takes them. Remember how you started. Remember how it was maybe difficult for you to wrap your head around, especially at first. And give people space without trying to force change on somebody that may not be going at the same pace that you are. Because that's a lot of what's going on here in Galatians. Those who are changing the gospel, the good news, want these Gentile believers to start over, to get sanctified in God's ways before they can be saved or justified in Messiah. A sort of a forced sanctification. At worst, this is what we hear about in modern terms of, get yourself cleaned up before you come to church. Anybody heard that attitude? Or expressed that attitude? Or had people tell you that attitude? Or one that's almost as bad is, hurry up and get your life cleaned up if you want to stay in this church. That kind of mentality. I've been around people, I've been around congregations with both of those attitudes, and they are both poison to the gospel, to faith in Messiah, to a new believer, to a congregation. For Paul, to let the Torah speak for itself to where he would die to his traditional legalistic misinterpretations, took him 3 years. Again, and after going up to Jerusalem and then back down to Antioch, he would then set out on his first missionary journey. So sometime in this time between his conversion and his visit to Jerusalem and the Acts Council, he goes on his first missionary journey. He talks about it in Acts chapter 14. So this is where he's starting over here in Antioch. He comes down here to Cyprus. He works his way up and around and then back. This is the region predominantly understood to be Galatia. Okay? So he says, from there they sailed, and when it was over, when he was finishing things up, it's from there they sailed back to Antioch, where they had been entrusted to the gracious care of God for the work now completed. And when they arrived and gathered together in Messiah's community, they began to report all that God had done in helping them, and that he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. And so they stayed quite a while with the disciples. They're staying where they came back to, where they started from, back here in Antioch in Syria. And they stayed quite a while down there. So that's the completion of the first missionary journey. And then there's this event here. After the end of that, after they've been staying there for a while, Paul goes to Jerusalem privately with Titus in Galatians chapter 2. It says this here. It says, then after 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus with me. Because of a revelation, I went up and presented to them the good news that I proclaim among the Gentiles. But I did so privately to those who seemed to be influential, to make sure I would not run or had not run in vain. So Paul, he's realizing that there's this debate that was beginning to grow. Those old schools of interpretation were saying that Paul was in the wrong. There's the school of Shammai, very popular among the Pharisees, taught that Gentiles had no place in the kingdom, that Gentiles could not participate in the worship of God, that Messiah was not for them unless they went through that legal process of conversion, the whole process called circumcision. You know, we've looked at this in the Highest Soul class that we've taught a couple of times. We're actually looking at trying to do that again because we've got some new people who've never been through it before. Maybe early next year, but they talked about it in terms of a 3-step process of being converted or born again. That there's the idea of circumcision for men, there's the idea of the mikvah or going through immersion with the purpose of going to the temple and offering a sacrifice. And remember, at this time there were only 2 categories of people. There's only 2 ways of life. There are only 2 faiths that exist, really, at this time. There's the faith of the Jewish people. There's Judaism. There's the temple service. That's the first. Then there is paganism. Everything else. All the other stuff that the Gentiles could participate in falls into one of those categories. You're either within Judaism or you're within paganism. You were a Jew or you were a pagan Gentile. There was no third option. There was no such thing as Christian or even Messianic that was separate or distinct or outside that umbrella that was the Jewish faith. But the question, again, is how were these Gentiles, these pagans, brought in? And it's a question about order. Order of salvation. Which is it going to be? How do you start? Do you come to Messiah first and then your life begins to change? Or do you have to change your life and behavior first by converting to Judaism before you come to Messiah? Another way of putting it is, do you start with justification through faith in Messiah, like we've talked about with the Abrahamic covenant, and then you begin adding that Mosaic covenant lifestyle, adding that Torah lifestyle? Or do you start with the Torah? Do you start with the Sinai covenant? You add the Torah lifestyle before you get to come to Messiah. That's the order. So this is not a debate that comes out of nowhere. It is a serious concern. It's not just a matter of tradition only. There were various interpretations or understandings, and there were various layers of things that there was some debate on. But there are elements of Torah that restrict participation. During unleavened bread, talks about everyone is supposed to be able to eat it if they're to be a part of the community. He says, during the first month, this is Exodus chapter 12, in the evening of the 14th day of the month, you are to eat matzah, until the evening of the 21st day of the month. For 7 days, no chametz is to be found in your houses, for whoever eats chametz, that soul will be cut off, that's fellowship, from the congregation of Israel, whether he is an outsider or one who is born in the land. So who's supposed to be eating the matzah? Is it just the Jewish people? Is the Bnei Israel? But is it also supposed to be the outsider are supposed to be eating the unleavened bread? You see that? So whether an outsider or one who is born in the land, they're all permitted and allowed and expected to be eating the unleavened bread. But Passover is different. In verse 43 of this same chapter, he says, Then Adonai said to Moses and Aaron, This is the ordinance of the Passover. No foreigner may eat it. But every man's servant that is bought for money after you have circumcised him may eat it. Nor should a visitor or a hired servant eat it. So basically, if you're going to participate in the Passover, you have to be circumcised as a man. So it's not as if this issue doesn't have some validity or question or merit, discussion, needing to figure it out. But this is a command specifically about Passover. And clearly Passover, clearly participation by the uncircumcised, that was permitted for some things, but it wasn't permitted for this. And so when Paul, after 14 years, goes up to Jerusalem and he brings Titus with him, who's come with Paul, one thing that's interesting is Titus is never mentioned by name in the book of Acts. But Titus has been with Paul for some time. Titus has been filled with the Holy Spirit. He's been participating in spreading the good news of the kingdom. He is growing as a disciple, as a leader. He's somebody that Paul sends to Corinth and things like that. Titus has come to Jerusalem. Does he count? Is he going to be welcome? Does he count as a disciple of Messiah Yeshua? Or does Titus have to start over and convert to Judaism? In that whole process, becoming legally Jewish, no longer considered a Gentile, and then say you are a believer in Messiah. That was the issue. And so Paul in Galatians says this, they've gone up together, so yet not even Titus, who was with me, a Greek, was forced or compelled to be circumcised. Now this issue came up because of false brothers, secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom in Messiah in order to bring us into bondage. But we did not give in to them even for a moment, so that the truth of the good news, and what's the good news? That whole redemptive plan of God that has included the Gentiles all along, that the truth of the good news might be preserved for you. So remember, if you go back a couple verses, Paul went up to Jerusalem in response to a revelation. Either this vision from God telling him to go, or someone arrived and revealed to Paul that, hey, there's this problem. So that tells me he didn't go during a pilgrimage feast. He apparently didn't go for Passover. So unless this Gentile made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem for Passover, the issue of circumcision and participation in fellowship isn't going to be an issue. Passover can only be officially done in Jerusalem with a lamb sacrificed in the temple. That's all Torah. That's all command. That's not really up for debate. But without that sacrifice, are any of us really keeping Passover? Not really. We recognize it. We participate in it the best that we can, but the restriction of circumcision doesn't really apply out there in the world, in Galatia, or even in the today like that, because there is no temple. They cannot really be doing Passover. It didn't really apply to Gentiles in Galatia either. So just keep in mind that this was a relatively private trip. Paul, Barnabas, and Titus went up privately. This was not a public meeting. This was not a big called meeting to try to settle the issue. And so when you look at the slide, he's finished his first missionary journey, and he has come to Jerusalem. But again, it was private. He says a couple of things, what about this Gentile? Do we accept him? Do we fellowship with him or not? And there was some argument. There was apparently some debate. But because Passover wasn't the issue, no one in Jerusalem forced him, made him, compelled Titus to be circumcised. And so that tells you what? That he was accepted. He was welcomed. But why does he call it bondage? This issue came up because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom in Messiah in order to bring us into bondage. You hear some people talk, they talk about the bondage being, obedience to the Torah and wanting to keep the Torah. Is that what he's talking about? That's not it at all. That's not Paul's attitude toward the Torah. He doesn't consider the Torah bondage. He says this in Romans, the Torah is holy and the commandment is holy, righteous, and good. So bondage is not the Torah, nor even keeping the Torah. That's not the bondage part. Bondage is the incorrect and out of proper order situation. The bondage is the false gospel of getting this wrong. That is the bondage. Bondage is, saying that you have to get cleaned up before being justified before God. Because we cannot keep the Torah in order to be saved. We're never going to be able to do that sufficiently to where we will be saved in order to be justified. We'll never escape from that prison if we have to be good enough, if our lives have to be obedient enough to earn or warrant salvation. But notice what Paul calls those who are pushing this issue, who are trying to force Titus to be circumcised. He calls them false brothers, and he calls them essentially spies. These are people coming in to the group of disciples, not because they necessarily believe in Yeshua, but because they want to make sure that those legalistic interpretations are applied. They want to be the gatekeepers and the enforcers. And if you were with us on Tuesday night, at the Torah Club, they want to be the door that controls who's coming in and out of the flock. Paul can recognize those people. He knows what they look like. He knows what they sound like, because he was one of those people. He knows that agenda. And at this point, Paul's argument won the day. Titus was not compelled to be circumcised, and the leaders in Jerusalem agreed. And they didn't try to change Paul's message or what he was teaching the Gentiles. He says, but from those who seem to be influential, whatever they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Well, those influential ones added nothing to my message. On the contrary, they saw that I had been entrusted with the good news, the redemptive plan of God, for the uncircumcised, just as Peter was for the circumcised. So they didn't try to change what Paul was teaching the Gentiles. He says, for the same God who was at work in Peter as an emissary to the Jews also was at work in me as an emissary to the Gentiles. That was recognized, that was established, realizing the favor that had been given to me, Jacob and Peter and John, who are the recognized pillars, the leadership. They shook hands in partnership with Barnabas and me, even for bringing somebody like Titus, so that we would go to the Gentiles and they to the Jews. And they asked only that we remember the poor, something I also was eager to do. So after this relatively private, small, and low-key meeting in Jerusalem, Paul and Barnabas with Titus apparently went back down to Antioch. And at some point, Peter comes to visit. So he's finished his first missionary journey. They finished that private meeting. And at some point, Peter visits. But the issue wasn't settled yet. The answer hasn't been made public yet. The issue was still a struggle and an argument. So there was no ruling. There was no binding or loosing at this point to settle the issue. And so what happens is this. In Acts chapter 15, just before the Jerusalem council, says, some men coming down from Judea were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. All of a sudden, it had gone beyond participation in Passover. You cannot participate in Messiah at all. What school is that? Is that school of Hillel or school of Shammai? That's much more about Shammai. Okay? You cannot be saved unless you are circumcised. So when Paul and Barnabas had a big argument and debate with them, the brothers appointed Paul and Barnabas with some others from among them to go up to Jerusalem to the emissaries and elders about this issue. Is this going to be a private meeting this time? No, it can't be. This was now going to be a public discussion and debate because the problem has now grown too big and there's no authority that can settle the issue that's away from Jerusalem. So this is what leads up to the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15. And the hard part is, with all of this, they've had this big argument and debate. It doesn't help that even Peter seems to be double-minded on this issue. It doesn't help that even Peter can be pushed around on the finer points of Torah observance. Even Peter, though it's after his experience with Cornelius and the centurion, he still has the mindset that he still has that rigidness of Shammai's thinking that hasn't quite gotten out of his head yet. Because Paul talks about it in Galatians like this. Because when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he was clearly in the wrong. For before certain people came from Jacob, he regularly ate with the Gentiles. He fellowshiped with them. But when they came, he began to withdraw and separate himself, fearing those from the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy. Have y'all ever seen somebody come into a congregation and within a short period of time completely rip it apart? Anybody seen that happen? It's not pretty. It really is not very pretty. But it can happen. And here they were having fellowship with one another. They were enjoying each other. And then some people showed up and ruined it. So even though Paul and Peter, they had agreed that their respective ministries were valuable and necessary, now there was a very public argument and spat. Peter was fellowshipping and eating with and enjoying the company of the Gentiles. He was counting them as fellow believers, these Gentiles that had come to believe in Yeshua. And this is despite the fact that those former pagans, you think they still had issues? Yeah. Had these pagans left everything behind yet? Or were they still working on it? Their lives were still, a work in progress. These Gentiles, they started the process of a life change in coming to Yeshua, but they might not have had the whole life change yet. Maybe they were struggling with their family who didn't understand this new faith that they were, and they were getting the pull to come back and participate in things. Maybe they were still going into homes with their idols. They wanted to visit mom and dad. They might have had to walk past a shrine or something else like that. Maybe they still struggled with keeping the Shabbat all the time, or stopping all of their work on those particular days. Maybe they struggled and they were buying meats in the marketplace that had been sacrificed to idols, not realizing that how big of a deal that is. Maybe they were even trying to buy the proper foods, but maybe the local Jewish community wouldn't sell it to them. Right? Because there's the break. And so with that, all of those realities, all of those possibilities, Peter was still willing to sit down at a table and eat with them. It's almost like if you go think back to school, high school, some of those days, where the cool quarterback of the football team was willing to sit at the band table or the nerd table. I was always at the band and the nerd table. That was me. Yeah, and here they are. The quarterback is sitting with them, and the nerds would even start to feel good about themselves, maybe start to feel a little accepted in the place until the rest of his football buddies came in to the cafeteria. Y'all ever seen things like that happen? Where all of a sudden it's like, oh man, I don't want to sit with these people, and you get up and you get away and you move over and you go back and sit with the cool people. Yeah. What happens to all those good feelings and sense of acceptance? All of a sudden it's gone. The Gentiles were relegated to untouchable because of these rigid kind of interpretations. So, we don't want you unless your life is perfect. Unless you are fully keeping the Torah, you don't really count and you're not really one of us. These are the ones who have been trying, these Jewish believers who were coming, they were the ones who had been living the Torah all of their lives. They didn't know a different way. They didn't know how different or how hard it can be for those who didn't grow up with it. But we pretty much know it's a pretty drastic change, isn't it? In coming this direction. Most of us are still trying to figure out. Most of us still have our moments, our struggles, and our issues. We would be in this group that they pull away from. Because we're not doing it well enough. So these that came from James, even Peter, had apparently forgotten, what it was like even for their own ancestors, after the Exodus. When they were brought to Mount Sinai. It was a hard shift and change for them in leaving Egypt. How long did it take them to get their act together before they were ready to go into the Promised Land? 40 years. 40 years, in wandering through the desert, they had to adopt their lifestyle to the Torah lifestyle. And even then, were they doing it perfectly? After 40 years. Do they still have their issues of disobedience? Yep. But now you have this situation where they're pulling and withdrawing away. There's now an open conflict between Peter and Paul. Is that a problem? Yeah, that's a problem. Paul goes on in verse 14. He says, when I saw that they were not walking in line with the truth of the good news. What's the good news? That redemptive plan of God that included who all along? Included the Gentiles all along. I said to Peter in front of everyone, if you, being a Jew, live like the Gentiles and not like the Jews, if you're willing to sit down and fellowship with them, how can you force the Gentiles to live like the Jews? We are Jews by birth and not sinners from among the Gentiles. We've been doing this our whole lives. And these guys They just started. Why are you messing around, Peter? Why are you so double-minded? Why are you switching back and forth and sending mixed signals? Why are you bowing to pressure and intimidation? Why are you living to please these men and not what you know to be true? Paul had even said something like that back in chapter 1, verse 10, where he says, am I now trying to win people's approval or God, or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Messiah. That's chapter 1, verse 10. What's Peter doing in this moment? He's trying to please people. So Paul, he isn't interested in their opinions. He isn't interested in their enforcement of that tradition or those disputable matters that not even all the Jewish people were agreeing on at the time. He is standing on the truth that these Gentiles are accepted by faith in the Messiah, that they have received the same Spirit as we have. That's one of the observations Peter makes with Cornelius. That they are on the same basis of faith as Abraham. And the Abrahamic covenant, which the only standard was he believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. That's the starting point for everybody. Believing and trusting. So stop treating them as if they're not even saved. Because Peter and all the Jews should know better than to think that they are right with God because they keep the Torah. They should know better than to think that. Because every year they make, when they go up to Jerusalem, especially for the Day of Atonement, things like that, every year they make sacrifices to atone for their breaking of the Torah that they don't even realize they're doing. Those unintentional sins. Peter and the others are not saved by keeping the Torah any more than the Gentile is. Yet we know that if a person is set right in whose eyes? Right in God's eyes. A person is set right not by deeds based on Torah, but rather through putting their trust, their faith in believing Messiah Yeshua. So even we have put our trust in Messiah Yeshua in order that we might be set right based on trust in Messiah and not by deeds based on Torah. Because no human will be justified by deeds based on Torah. He's hammering this point pretty hard. And who is the we that he's talking about? Yet we know that a person, even a Jew, is not set right by deeds based on Torah, but rather through putting faith in Messiah Yeshua. So even we Jews have put our faith, our trust in Messiah Yeshua in order that we Jews might be set right. Because are they set right based on keeping the Torah? No. They're set right based on faith in Messiah, not by deeds based on Torah. Because no human, not even us Jews, will be justified by deeds based on Torah. So why are you holding these Gentiles to a standard that God doesn't hold you to? If God held the Jews to that standard, then no one, not even the Jews, would be saved. It's not as if the Torah is not the problem. It's not as if the Torah isn't the right way to live. It is. But it doesn't save. The Torah is not the starting point with Messiah. The Torah is what comes after you have started with Messiah. That's the proper order. That is faith, belief, trust, something that is available as a blessing. Believing and trusting that blessing that was supposed to be to all the nations That was the Abrahamic covenant. Through you, all the nations of the earth, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Just as Abraham believed, and it was credited to him as righteousness under the Abrahamic covenant, so all the families of the earth can believe and have that faith credited to them. And that's when you have done that, when you have put your faith and your trust in you, started with that point in Messiah and accepted that gift of salvation through what he did on the cross and his resurrection. Then your life truly begins to change and become conformed to the way of life that is pleasing to God. You didn't even know it wasn't before. And it doesn't happen in an instant or overnight. Again, it took Paul 3 years to change his thinking. It takes a lifetime of learning in this walk. It takes passing that on to generations that follow, so maybe they won't even know a different way of life and a different way to live. But it's this first generation that will struggle the most. The generation that follows who grow up with it and ideally choose to continue to live in that blessing will find it more natural. Why is it such a problem for us today? Because that cycle of passing it on to the next generation was broken. And so we were not taught to live this way. If we didn't grow up with this, it has taken a great shift in order to get back to it. But Peter, doesn't he know this? That nobody is going to be set right and justified before God based on Torah observance? Shouldn't he know that? Yeah, he knows that. And this truth is essential for the future of Yeshua's people. And so it's after this confrontation with Peter, when they had this big argument, when the issue is not settled publicly, that the Acts 15 council becomes necessary. We're going to come back to that later, at another day, to look back at this decision. But real quick, you have that Peter visiting, and that kind of sets off what leads to coming into Acts chapter 15. And you almost get the impression that by the time they travel from Antioch to Jerusalem, Paul and Peter have had quite a talking together. Now, once that decision is made, and again, we're going to look more closely at the Acts 15 council at another time, but once that is made, Paul seems to go back to Antioch with the news, with the decision, with the letter in hand. And so it says in Acts chapter 15, it seemed good to the emissaries and the elders with the whole community, now that they've decided, now that they have bound and loosed the issue appropriately, to choose men from among themselves to send to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. And they sent Judah also, called Barsabbas, and Silas, leading men among the brethren, and this letter along with them. Why did they do that? Why didn't they just send Paul and Barnabas back? Did they need some more witnesses to confirm the decision that Paul and Barnabas weren't just making it up and just take our word for it, guys? No. They sent Judah and Silas, leading men, to try to establish that. So when they were sent off, they went down to Antioch, and when they had gathered the whole group together, they delivered the letter. The people read it, and they rejoiced over its encouragement. Judah and Silas, prophets themselves, encouraged the brothers and sisters with a long message and strengthened them. They witnessed and testified about what's going on. And so after spending some time there, they were sent off with shalom by the brothers and sisters to those who had sent them. But Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch, teaching and proclaiming the word of the Lord with many others. So Paul, they went down here to Jerusalem, and now he had come back up here to Antioch. And he is staying there. And then Paul and Barnabas decided to go on their second journey. It says, after some days, Paul said to Barnabas, let's return and visit the brothers and sisters in every city where we have proclaimed the word of the Lord to see how they are. So they can give this news, give this letter, and tell them the decision of the council so that this debate can be settled and be over. And so he starts. They've been in Antioch for a while, and he starts his second missionary journey. You see that? He starts out over from here in Antioch. He goes up and he visits a lot of those places that he had been on his first trip. Ends up going all over the place and eventually making his way back. We're not going to get into that today. I bet you're happy about that. But this is when Paul has made this trip. And he's passed through Galatia. This is when Paul starts to hear about what's happening after he has moved on. He has come through Galatia and he's delivered the decision from the Jerusalem council. And he has moved on, but now he's starting to hear things that's going on behind him. That despite the binding and the loosing decision from Jerusalem, despite the official letter that has been accompanying them and the confirming witnesses that should have settled the issue, there are some other of these legalistic believers that are following behind him and still making the same argument that they've been doing before, insisting that you have to be circumcised in order to be saved. These false believers apparently refuse to accept it and continue to try to enforce that conversion issue, that Torah observance, the circumcision, before the Gentiles will be allowed to receive Messiah or to be included in the community. And this is why Paul is so angry in chapter 1. When he says, I am amazed that you are so quickly turning away from the one who called you by the grace of Messiah to a different good news. Not that there is another, but only some who are confusing you and want to distort the good news of Messiah. And what does he say should happen to those people who are distorting the good news? He says, let them be cursed. Let them be outside of the fellowship. Let them be the ones that are put out and cut off, because they are going against all this stuff. They're going against these confrontations. They're going against these discussions. They're going against this ruling from the council. They're the ones who are changing things. They're the ones that are holding on to that rigid, legalistic interpretation. And so Paul is fighting for them to hold on to what is true. And again, the point is not that the Torah and that way of life is not important or not necessary or something that should be added to the life of a believer, even a Gentile. But it's not a prerequisite. It's a starting point. As we'll get to when we look at that another time. We'll take a closer look at the Acts 15 and the ruling and exactly what they say and what it means. Does having it up here like this help? And seeing kind of the timeline of things? It helped me a lot to try to get my head around what's happening. Because Galatians is not, he's writing about things over here at the end. He's writing about things that happened some years ago, and some of them are not even in Antioch in Galatia. He's talking about Antioch in Syria. So it can be a little confusing. But I hope that makes a little more sense for the setting and what's going on. Because this was something that they had to get right. But what we're also seeing with this argument that Paul is making, they're also falling trap is that those who don't understand, as Peter talks about, those that twist and distort Paul's writings, because are they difficult to understand sometimes? Yeah. Are other people twisting and distorting it to say, well, that means I don't need the Torah at all? That's not what he's saying at all. But I hope we can get our mind and our head around all of this. And it can be well grounded in us, because we're a generation that's almost just like them. Fighting some of the same fights, having some of the same arguments that they were having. What is our place? What is our relationship to the believing community, to the Jewish community, to the Torah? We still need to have those questions dealt with and answered.